Hi there. Welcome to Thursdays at Home, a live streamed hour of performances, readings, and more from IU students, faculty, and staff, brought to you by the IU Arts and Humanities Council. My name is Anna Groover, and I'm a council intern and your host this evening. Singing and dancing and creating and writing and making music are always important, but they're even more important right now when we're all physically distant from each other. So we're glad you can join us to celebrate these artistic practices in many forms. Tonight, you'll be hearing from historian and Eskenazi professor Heather Akou, anthropologist and professor Shane Greene, religious studies scholar and professor Candy Gunther Brown, and musician and Jacobs professor Jeff Nelson. Let's get started. Our first guest today is Heather Akou. Heather is a historian of fashion, dress, and the body. She is co-area coordinator and associate professor of fashion design in the Eskenazi School of Art, Architecture, and Design at IU Bloomington, and the director of IU's prestigious Sage collection. She is the co-founder of the Dress and Body Association and serves on the editorial advisory board for Bloomsbury Fashion Central. Her research interests include African dress and fashion, Islamic fashion, the politics of dress, the embodiment of religion, working class histories of dress, narratives surrounding dress and the body, and how non-Western and minority dress is represented in museum collections. Tonight, she'll be reading from her in-progress novel, Not Like Her, A Family Story. Thanks for joining us, Heather.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm just going to start. I have some images to share that will loop as I'm talking. So a quick introduction. I'm writing this novel about my grandmother, Lila Slayback, based on historical evidence about her life and about dress during that time period. Unfortunately, I never met Lila. She had 7 children and died when she was only 36. For the last few years of her life, she was a divorced single mother, which was really not socially acceptable in the 1950s. What you need to know for this reading is that Lila was also from a big family. Her parents had 8 children, and Lila was one of the youngest, born in 1922. When she was 6 years old, her parents moved the family from their farm to the city of La Crosse, which at the time was the 3rd largest city in Wisconsin. Shortly before this chapter begins in 1942, her parents had decided to move back out into the country, leaving their house in La Crosse to Lila's slightly older sister, Vida. Lila was supposed to get married, but her fiancé, Earl, broke off the engagement to marry someone else. So Lila was working and living with Vida, her husband, Red, their infant son, David, and her younger brother, Loy. So this is a little selection from the book. One day, Lila went to work and was shocked when a man answered the door. "Can I help you?" he said. "Yes, I'm here to clean for Mrs. Davis. Is she in?" The man looked at her up and down and said brusquely, "My mother has become very ill. The doctors are not expecting her to survive much longer. Your services are no longer needed here." He shut the door in her face before she could respond. It was the end of the week and Mrs. Davis was supposed to pay her tomorrow. She knocked on the door again, but the man didn't answer. Lila had recently turned 20. Vida had not demanded that she attend Sunday Mass, but did ask her to set a good example for Loy. She went, but every week Lila looked around at the other people and thought, "Is this really my life?" It was so boring. Lila could have found another cleaning job, but decided that she needed something more exciting. With the last bit of money she had earned by working for Mrs. Davis, she took a streetcar downtown to purchase a new outfit. Her usual house dress and apron was good enough for cleaning, but it was not going to help her land a job as a waitress. She had already stopped at 5 places to inquire if they were hiring. They all said something like, "Sure, leave your phone number and we'll give you a call." Lila didn't have a phone or a phone number. The first place she went to look for a dress was Dorflinger's, but she felt so conspicuous. She walked up the stairs to avoid the elevator man. When the sales staff asked if she would like any help, she politely said, "No, thank you, I'm just looking." She noticed that 2 of the clerks were engaged in a quiet conversation. Were they talking about her? After a few minutes, she left and walked down Main Street. It was her first time wandering alone downtown, and there were so many shops. Shops for shoes, shops for jewelry, shops just for flowers. At the end of the block was the 5 and Dime, FW Woolworth. Lila pushed open the door and immediately felt better. The lights were bright and cheerful, and the store was full of people of all ages, regular people like her. Lila walked past the lunch counter near the front. Signs informed her that ladies' clothing was on the second floor. As she began trying on the dresses, Lila was relieved to find that she had no trouble fitting into them. It was very different from her first experience shopping with Aunt Hattie. After some consideration, she decided to buy a knee-length navy blue dress with white trim around the collar and a pair of pumps. The total cost was $8.45. Lila was not used to spending that kind of money, but the next day when she put on the outfit, Vita said, "Wow, Lila, you look stunning." It was a good feeling. At the first restaurant she walked into that morning, the manager offered her a job on the spot. Lila could hardly believe it, but the pay at Carol's was more than double what she had been earning from Mrs. Davis. Sometimes she helped with a little cleaning, sweeping floors or washing the dishes, but overall it was so much easier being a waitress. Lila thought it was fun talking with her customers and making suggestions. Often it was just about the weather. "Boy, it sure is a nippy one today." But sometimes they asked, "What is your favorite?" Or, "What do you think about the soup of the day?" It was a joy for someone who loved to eat. Lila often tried the special since the meals were free for employees. Although she had to wear a uniform, a blue button-down dress with a white apron and a little white cap, the owner gave everyone on staff extra money to purchase their uniforms from a particular shop downtown. It saved money and made it easy to get dressed for work. Lila felt proud to be part of the Carol's team. She even won the award for Employee of the Month in October. After 6 p.m., the restaurant turned into a bar. In the back of the building, there was a dance hall and a small bowling alley. It was always packed, especially on the weekends. Not far from La Crosse, there was a large army base called Fort McCoy. Lila had heard that new recruits were being sent there for training before heading off to war. La Crosse was where they went to drink, whether to celebrate life or to escape their fears of death. As she walked to and from work, Lila had noticed that the number of bars in La Crosse was increasing. Killian's, Fish's, the Cavalier Lounge. Even Cecil was talking about saving money to open a bar. One day, the manager at Carol's asked if she could stay for a few minutes after work. She worried all day that she had done something wrong and was about to be fired. She was so relieved when he said, "Could you start working in the evening? You would make a great cocktail waitress, Lila." It was flattering to think that she might be great at something. Without thinking, she immediately replied, "Yes, I'm willing to work in the evening." She didn't know how she was going to justify the late hours to Vita and Red, but why not give it a try? The uniform for the bar was different. A short red dress with a matching shrug tied in a bow and strappy black high heels. No apron, no pockets, no pads of paper for writing down orders. It was very glamorous, but Lila was nervous. There were so many new things to memorize. Types of beer, names of cocktails. What on earth was a green dragon? She laughed the first time someone ordered one. The first weekend she worked at the bar, Lila told Vita that she was going to the movies for a double feature. Vita replied, "Oh, that sounds like fun. Have a good time." She carried her uniform in an oversized handbag and put it on as soon as she got to the restaurant. She hoped that nobody would notice when she returned home at 3 o'clock in the morning, and for a few months, it seemed that nobody did. As Lila settled into her new job, she found that there were many advantages to working as a cocktail waitress. The pay was better, and so were the tips. The money was piling up in a cookie tin under her mattress. She had never imagined that she would be able to save so much. What if she saved enough to buy a car or even a house? The possibilities were exhilarating. It was also fun to flirt with the young soldiers. She felt good about serving them and bringing a little joy into their lives. It was a thrill to be called beautiful every day by so many handsome young men. Lila had never felt so desirable. Her mother always said it was lazy to sleep past 6 o'clock in the morning, but working at night was such a pleasure. Lila had never felt so alive. How could anything so enjoyable be wrong? One day she was washing laundry when Vita said, "Lila, we need to talk." She asked if it could wait. The laundry wasn't going to wash itself, but Vita insisted. Lila sighed and said, "All right, Vita, what do we need to talk about?" Vita looked nervous. She said, "Lila, I've noticed that you're sleeping later than usual. I thought you were just going to the movies in the evening, but Mrs. Christensen has insomnia. She told me yesterday that sometimes you come home as late as 4 o'clock in the morning." Lila stopped cranking the ringer and said, "Little busybody, I don't know why anybody listens to her." She started cranking again, but Vita put her hand on Lila's arm. "Lila, I'm worried about you. I know Earl is the one who called off the wedding, not you. But you're 20 years old and you're not married. What are you doing so late at night? The neighbors think you're selling yourself to men. It was like a verbal slap in the face. Lila narrowed her eyes and said sharply, "Is that what you think of me?" Vita blushed and said, "Well, not really, but I don't know what to think. You come with us to church and then you disappear at night. It's not what a good woman does." David is too young to understand, but what kind of example do you think you're setting for Loy? Lila was angry. Was it so terrible wanting to work outside of the house and not get married? Lila said, "I am not selling myself, Vita. I'm offended that you would think that." Vita quietly said, "I think I hear David crying." And that was the end of the conversation. Lila wanted to tell her everything about her job and the money, even about her relationship with Lloyd and how much she was missing him. But how? Where could she possibly begin? She didn't judge Vita for choosing to get married and start a family of her own, but Lila was making different choices, choices that she didn't think Vita would understand. It was easier to avoid having a conversation than to bridge the gap that was growing between them. All right, so obviously there's quite a bit before and after that, but I really appreciate you listening. This is the first time I'm reading anything from this novel in public, and actually my first novel as well. So really appreciate having you as an audience.
Thanks for sharing your wonderful writing and process with us, Heather. That's really cool that this is the first time you are reading it. And
yeah, the very first.
All right. If you're just tuning in, this is Thursdays at Home. Join us here on our Facebook page on Tuesday evenings at 8 p.m. for Confronting Racism, a series of conversations with faculty experts from IU and other universities designed to examine systemic racism in its varied forms and to explore the modes and methods of protest used to confront this central issue in American life. Next week, we'll cover media, technology, and social media. Find more info in the comments. Our next guest is Shane Greene. Shane is a professor of anthropology at IU Bloomington. His work focuses on punk subcultures, music, art, popular culture, race, resistance, anarchism, and social movements, primarily in Latin America. In 2016, he published Punk and Revolution, about the political history of punk in Lima, Peru, and he is currently working on an edited compilation with punks and academics who engage with punk from all over the Americas for a forthcoming book titled Punk, Las Americas Edition. Tonight, he will be sharing a few lesser-known things about punk, the etymology of the word itself, and how it eventually transformed from insult into a moniker for an artistic and musical movement. Take it away, Shane.
Hi, everybody. So thanks. Very glad to be here, sharing a few, as you'll see, fairly spontaneous thoughts rooted in this work that I've been doing over the last several years about punk, sort of trying to basically come up with a series of hopefully new, novel, different, perhaps even dissident things to say about punk, both individually and sort of as part of a kind of broader collective of people, both punks, academics who study punk, musicians, artists, photographers, zinesters, and a whole variety of different kinds of folks. What I'm going to talk about, which I've sort of titled, maybe I'll sort of retitle it 2 or 3 things you probably don't know about punk, depending on whether or not I can get to all of them in this kind of spontaneous 15 minutes or so that I have. It comes basically out of a very collective book project titled Punk Las Americas Edition. It's just sort of an attempt to kind of use a punk lens or a series of punk lenses to sort of rethink the Americas in its kind of big hemispheric sense, right? So not America, the singular, the imperial, but Americas in the plural, all the sort of plurality that contains, the different histories, the different languages, the different cultural dimensions, the conflicts, the struggles, and so on and so forth. So that's what we're doing in that book. And sort of one of the things, the pathways that it took me down was to try to do more or as exhaustive as possible kind of history and etymology of the trajectory of the word itself, the term punk itself, which is not in any way, shape, or form kind of obviously derived from a European language. And then to sort of ask another kind of necessary follow-up question, which is to say, sort of where do people typically start with what they understand punk to be in 2020, right? And sort of contemporary times. and sort of start digging away at the various kind of assumptions that are behind that. So for example, very quickly, some of those assumptions, if you're under 30, odds are you might have sort of things like Green Day as sort of first points of reference. If you're over 40 or over 50, you might more likely have sort of late 70s, early 80s musical kind of reference points, the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, and so on and so forth. And all of that actually sort of comes later than the story that I want to tell tonight. About this much longer, literally as old or older than the Americas themselves, a story that's behind or sort of embedded in very interestingly kind of invisible ways in this one singular term. So sort of interested in the etymology, and then also interested in the precise moment or series of moments, it's not a singular moment, series of moments when this term, which developed over time into an insult, sort of street slang and an insult, which I'll talk about a little bit about in just a second, into something that since the late 1970s, you know, sort of in most people's kind of imagination references a sort of popular culture, subculture, heavily associated with music and art, and, you know, sort of iconic bands and figures and so on since the late 1970s. So sort of looking for that transformation moment, right? The moment when it goes from an insult into a moniker, right? A label for a particular kind of underground at one moment, mainstream at other moments, musical and artistic phenomenon. So that's what I'm going to talk about through this lens of the 2 or 3 things you probably don't know about punk. The first of those, and this is, you know, sort of, we elaborate on this in the book, and it's used as a sort of point of departure for actually what turns into more than 25 different actors participating in this book, doing very, very different things in widely sort of varied places across the Americas. Everything literally from Alaska to Patagonia. Parts of the US are talked about: Mexico, Central America, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Argentina, Peru, Colombia, Brazil, et cetera, et cetera. So not absolutely everything, but enough to kind of give a real kind of hemispheric scope to this book. And we depart from this kind of question of sort of what's embedded in the term itself, right? And how does it eventually take on this movement, this transformation that where it starts to indicate in most people's mind, a particular late 1970s moment, and musical and artistic phenomenon in particular. So step one, the first thing that you quite possibly do not know, is that if you do a very, very long-term etymology, the kind of trajectory of this work, and like many etymologies, you know, there's sort of speculations involved. It's not absolutely easy to sort of document these things. Certain things can be documented. If you're interested, look me up. I can send you to certain kind of references to look into this. So there's a bit of speculation involved around certain terms, and certainly a term like the term punk, because it is not self-evidently from European languages. Well, it turns out if you do the long-term history, it's actually quite likely, quite probable that it derives from the Lenape language, a Native American language. In colonial terminology, people who were designated as the Delaware peoples in colonial times, and still are actually federally recognized as the Delaware tribe. Obviously, originally, historically, occupying the territory around the Delaware River up in the Northeast, but as was the case with most Native Americans in the United States, they were pushed geographically into all manner and sorts of different directions. So contemporary Lenape are typically, or Delaware tribe, are typically located either in Ontario or in Oklahoma. And one of the interesting things about that is that they have a, you know, obviously these were oral languages that over time, as the sort of conquest and colonization took place and interaction with European languages took place, became literate languages that could be rooted in text. And so if you go online and do something as simple as look up the Delaware Tribe of Indians and or the Lenape Talking Dictionary, you can see the word that the word punk is likely derived from. They spell it in contemporary Lenape orthography P-U-N-K-W. I'm going to that site now. And if you put it in the Lenape side of the dictionary, it's a talking dictionary because they've actually uploaded phonetic sounds. You can click on the words and hear what they sound like. This is what the presumptive root word of the word punk in the Lenape language sounds like. I'm going to play it a few times, so hopefully you can get a sense of it. Boom, 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 bunk, no? So that's interesting because like already embedded in this term is literally centuries of history, right? Centuries of conflict, of struggle, of resistance, of domination, of power relations, both in the context of the way languages interact and the context of the way the people who speak those languages and have come into contact through the colonial experience have interacted. So we sort of were interested in that precisely because it opens up really, literally the long-term history of the Americas, not just the United States, the Americas in that sense, right? As the term develops and sort of gets appropriated and borrowed and used in different contexts and used by speakers of English in the context of the historical development of the United States, it starts to take on other connotations and meanings. So in Lenape, the word punk means ashes or dust. It means sort of the remains or the leftover, that which remains after something is burned or destroyed. As the centuries progress, and I'm obviously condensing a lot of time here, as the centuries progress, and particularly over the past couple of centuries, right, leading up to our present, this term punk, derived from this indigenous language, takes on other meanings in the mouths and the sort of imaginations of Europeans, of English speakers, right? Particularly the idea of being worthless, of being a worthless person. I'll put it in quotes, air quotes. It took on much more specific references or just simply meaning bad, like a bad person, a worthless person. It took on in specific contexts the meaning of prostitute, the meaning of queer, the meaning of catamite, the meaning of sort of petty street criminal, not like a sort of grandiose kind of organized crime figure, but like a sort of petty street criminal that's sort of craftily trying to figure out how to survive in precarious circumstances in an urban context, for example, right? But worthless, right? Again, in quotes, in a similar, interestingly, if you think about it, sense, like sort of those particular sectors, the informal, the lumpen proletariat, the marginal, the criminal or criminalized sectors of our societies that we precisely prefer not to think about, right? Or prefer, if possible, right, to leave behind, right? So sort of the social remains, right? The socially marginal, right? The socially deviant, sexually deviant, and so on and so forth, right? So it sort of took on those connotations over the course of the last couple of centuries, and it even had particular inflections within the Black community, within the African American community as well, right? It sort of got appropriated and used very commonly in prison slang as well, scenarios and sort of urban scenarios, right? So the punk for quite a long time over the past couple of centuries was essentially an insult. It was street slang and it was an insult issued to people. So then the sort of obvious question that sort of emerged was like, when did it become kind of appropriated, or how did it become kind of appropriated at a different moment and start referring to musical phenomenon, artistic phenomenon, and ultimately, eventually appropriated in a similar way that other terms that were once derogatory or insulting or slang in that sense become sort of self-affirmative, right? Sort of become something a group of people or an individual people actually identify with, right? And want to sort of identify with and identify as part of a community with, right? And that starts to happen at a couple of interesting moments. Not the classic iconic moments that you might immediately think of with the Ramones and the Sex Pistols or even Punk Magazine, which was launched in New York City in 1976, but actually much prior at the turning point between the 1960s and the 1970s. And there's a couple of things to talk about there. So I'm now on to sort of point number 2, things that you quite possibly were sort of going prior to that whole kind of iconic media explosive moment of the Sex Pistols in 1977, or even the Ramones and the underground New York scene, the Talking Heads, all of that kind of stuff in the mid 1970s. We're talking about the late 1960s and turn of the 1970s. The first of those is this little joya, as they say in Spanish, this little joy and treasure. Sanders Truck Stop by Ed Sanders. This was his first solo album. He was a sort of countercultural, political, and musical and artistic figure as part of the band called the Fugs in the mid 1960s, which eventually broke up in, I think, 68. And he releases this solo album called Sanders Truck Stop, which if you go listen to it at some point is super fascinating. There's a kind of super sardonic, ironic, satirical tone to the entire album. He sort of personifies this kind of hillbilly character throughout the music. And there's this kind of like, kind of kitschy sort of hillbilly country sound to go along with the kind of personification of a hillbilly figure. And he's basically sort of doing a massive, massive critique of the failures of sort of liberation struggles in American society and global society in the late 1960s, because he himself became very, very disillusioned with the outcome of 68, for example. And so you sort of get that in musical form through this album, but the importance of it in terms of doing this kind of long-term trajectory and etymology of the word, and this moment where it starts to transform and starts to be referred as something that refers to musical phenomena and artistic phenomenon, is that when he was interviewed about this album in 1970 in the Chicago Tribune, right, so sort of the next year after it comes out in 69, he made this also very ironic and sardonic remark to the interviewer that his best descriptor of this album that he had just produced was that it was punk rock redneck sentimentality. Punk rock redneck sentimentality. So he was sort of appropriating this idea of punk as an insult, as an urban slang insult that it had become. And sort of being, ironic, auto irony, basically, sort of using it as a sort of self-ironic term. It's a brilliant record. You should check it out, both musically and sort of conceptually. He has his wife write a letter on the back of it, or he sort of reproduces the letter his wife wrote on the back of it. And so I'm going to read just a little bit of this so you can get a sense of how sardonic this album is. This is his wife writing about the album. On this album, Ed has told you a bunch of stories that he thought up in his head. Facing our civilization are hundreds of serious questions, and Ed is asking a few of them, such as, did Detroit invent the backseat to ruin the morals of America? Why did they allow shopping centers to have parking lots so that kids could sell each other dope on dark nights? Why is it that youngsters color in the map of Jerusalem at Sunday school with psychedelic day glow colors? So it's a sort of reckoning, if you will, a kind of ironic reckoning with the kind of late 60s hippie and yippie moments. And it's one of the early moments when you see, in a press form, at least something you can document in textual form, the phrase punk or punk rock being used in reference to music. A year later, in 1971, so that we're now on to point number 3 and my final point. I'm not playing clips of any of this music, basically because apparently Facebook doesn't like that kind of thing. They will sort of, mute it out if it detects it as something that has copyright or intellectual rights over it. So you'll have to go look it up for yourself. All right, look up trucks. I in particular recommend the Iliad. It's one of the songs on this album, Sanders Truck Stop. Third and final point in this little short tour of the 2 or 3 things that you probably don't know about punk and its various weird, strange transformations and all the things that they might potentially tell us about the history of the Americas. In 1971, in at the time, fairly underground rock magazine, now kind of retrospectively pretty well known, called Cream magazine, a rock writer named Dave Marsh wrote the following little line in a review of a concert he had just seen in Detroit by this band, Question Mark and the Mysterians. He wrote this line, in addition to many other things that he had to say about Question Mark and the Mysterians, that they were an exposition, a landmark exposition of punk rock. So sort of following up on something he had seen or was circulating in the air, in the ethos or in the moment, that people like Ed Sanders and others had started to sort of use this phrase or this phrasing to think about the evolution and the sort of transformations that were happening in rock. The interesting thing about this band, so they're actually a mid-60s band. The probably hit that's now would be, if you would find it on an oldies station, if you found it at all, playing on the airwaves these days, is 96 Tears. Unbelievably awesome song. Also go check that out if you haven't. So it came out in a 45 version first in 1966. The album with a bunch of other songs obviously came out in, I can't remember, 67 or 68, but they were around for quite a while. They're still around actually, and most of them are still alive, still live in Michigan, still do reunion shows. And a couple of interesting sort of tidbits about that band. So Dave Marsh writes them into rock and roll kind of journalism, underground journalism and history at that moment in 1971 when he sees them play in 1971 as a landmark exposition of punk rock. But some super interesting things about that band. They were from Saginaw, Michigan, so go Midwest. They were all Mexican-American. It was essentially the sons of, all guys in the band, sons of immigrant families, some of whose families were actually born in Mexico, but mostly grew up initially in San Antonio in Texas, and basically started a process of sort of internal migration within the United States between Texas and Michigan to work the fields initially in Michigan. And then eventually their family, their dads, basically their families got sort of industrial jobs at the soon to die industrial sector that we sort of associate with the Detroit and Michigan area in that sort of moment in the 1950s and 1960s. And they just stayed, right? They stayed in mid-Michigan, basically. So they're from Saginaw, Michigan, but in fact, Mexican-American and sort of implicit, right, in their biographies, in their story, in their sort of family histories, is a much broader dialogue, movements, immigration, borders, even languages. If you actually go in and type in not 96 tears, but 96 lágrimas, you will find that all manner and sort of Mexican, Peruvian, Spanish from Spain, Argentinian bands at the time, the 1960s, did Spanish language covers of this tune, in part because it was a kind of hit phenomenon. It was sort of rose to the Billboard, to the tops of the Billboard charts in the 1960s. And because they immediately understood that sort of rock and roll was a global phenomenon that could also be readapted to other contexts and languages and realities, right? So sort of it was translated, and a bunch of different kind of Spanish language versions of 96 Tears by other bands exist out there. You can also look those up. So again, sort of this third and final point is interesting to me precisely because it expands our horizon. We sort of start out with this kind of Native American story, right? Literally centuries of history embedded in this one term, punk. And I'm sort of ending on this point of sort of a story that continues to develop and was always kind of global, border crossing, language crossing borders, and not only of sort of nationality, national borders or citizenship, and through bodily movement, right? And through sort of the economic forces that sort of move people and sort of make people move from one spot or from one country to another, but also linguistic borders, right? Sort of opening up the question of sort of rock and sort of punk in this particular moment as inherently sort of containing this story of a borderless phenomenon, a phenomenon that's sort of bound to move across borders in that sense from the very start. Okay, I think that's good enough for me. And I did in fact get to my 3 things. There's lots of other fascinating things I could tell you, but I think I'm gonna leave it there.
Thanks, Shane. That was just so interesting, and I never knew any of the complexities of the history of punk before today. So thank you again.
Absolutely.
All right. If you're just tuning in, this is Thursdays at Home. Welcome. Our next guest is Candy Gunther Brown. Candy is a historian and ethnographer of religion and culture and professor of religious studies at IU Bloomington. Her particular focus is the United States, understood within the broader frameworks of the Americas and global cultural flows. Her books include The Word in the World, Evangelical Writing, Publishing, and Reading in America, 1789 to 1880, Testing Prayer, Science and Healing, The Healing Gods, Complementary and Alternative Medicine in Christian America, and, most recently, Debating Yoga and Mindfulness in Public Schools, Reforming Secular Education or Reestablishing Religion. Tonight, she will talk about legal controversies over yoga and mindfulness in public schools and suggest how schools can offer wellness programs while avoiding legal and ethical challenges. Thanks for joining us, Candy.
Thanks so much, Anna. It's wonderful to be here with you. And what I'm going to do then is just talk a little bit about why so much controversy from yoga and mindfulness programs. There's a lot of popularity in these programs, and there's also a lot of people who have concerns about them. And so I want to start off by introducing a particular kind of yoga that's been popular in the United States broadly, also in public schools, known as Ashtanga Yoga. It was developed by an Indian Hindu by the name of Sri Krishna Patabi Joyce at the beginning of the 20th century. Ashtanga means 8-limbed yoga, and so it starts off with an emphasis on moral restraints and ethical observances, the yamas and the niyamas from the Yoga Sutras, and then really focuses on postures or asanas. And that's what yoga today is often most known for, are the physical postures. There are a number of other practices that lead up to samadhi, which Joyce defined as becoming one with God. According to Joyce, the essence of yoga is to reach oneness with God. And for anyone who practices yoga correctly, the love of God will develop whether they want it or not. And so Joyce has an idea that religion is more about what you do, what your practices are, what your experiences are, than just what you believe or what you say. Ashtanga always begins with sun salutations or Surya Namaskara, which Joyce defined as a prayer to the sun god Surya. It involves rising up in prayer and petition, bowing down in surrender and worship, and then rising up remembering that the true sun or the divine is within. It involves various positions, for instance, of the hands, the well-known praying hands or Anjali Mudra positions symbolizing union with the divine. Ashtanga always ends with lotus or Padmasana. And this also involves certain symbolic gestures, such as the wisdom gesture or the Jnana Mudra, subordinating the individual spirit to the universal spirit. Ashtanga Yoga was introduced into a public school district in Encinitas, California, a suburb of San Diego. And the story started back in 1975 when Joyce visited Encinitas at the invitation of one of his students. At the time, his son accompanied him, and this son, Manju, moved there, got married, and his wife, Nancy, began teaching kindergarten in this particular school district. Fast forward to 2011, and Joyce had a number of wealthy devotees, among them Sonia and Paul Tudor Jones, who established the Joyce Foundation in 2011 with the mission of putting yoga into public schools. They initially gave a $500,000 grant to the school district to start an Ashtanga Yoga program. Ultimately, they gave some $4 million to the district over the course of 5 years. The foundation worked with the district to select, train, and supervise teachers and to write a curriculum. So here's what the pilot year curriculum looked like. It involved moral and ethical teachings from the yamas and the niyamas. Students did the sun salutations. They followed the different postures from the Joyce Ashtanga Institute poster, always starting with sun salutations, ending in lotus and corpse or resting pose. The teacher read from a textbook, Myths of the Asanas, which teaches that postures symbolize various gods. The students learned to chant Om, the sound of the universe. They placed their hands in Jnana Mudra. They meditated sitting in lotus. They used Sanskrit terminology, and they watched a film, Ashtanga New York, which features Pattabhi Joyce leading a large group in Surya Namaskara. The following fall, the program was rolled out to the entire district. Teachers made a construction paper Ashtanga tree labeled in Sanskrit with all 8 limbs leading up to Samadhi. Students used guided meditation scripts, and they colored mandalas, circular symbols which invoke the presence of the divine. There were complaints, not only by Christians, but by Hindus and by atheists as well. In response, the school district removed Sanskrit terminology and other, quote, cultural references. By the spring of that year, however, the practices had not really changed very much. Children were still doing sun salutations and lotus, still using the praying hands and the wisdom gesture. Children were still using Sanskrit, even though the teachers had stopped. So for instance, namaste, often translated the divine in me, bows to the divine in you, or shavasana or corpse. They were still sitting in lotus, closing their eyes, putting their hands in Jnana Mudra, and chanting Om. And here are just some pictures which show you a little bit of the flavor of the school district, including field trips to the Self-Realization Fellowship meditation gardens. There was a court case, Sedlock v. Baird, which was decided in 2013. There was appeal in 2015. And I actually ended up serving as an expert witness in this case, trying to explain what yoga is, what religion is, and how these things might or might not fit together. The issue was that the First Amendment is that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The Supreme Court in the middle of the 20th century prohibited prayer and Bible reading programs in following this amendment. And so the question was, should yoga be put into the same category? The judge ruled that yoga is religious, but He also defined religion in very word or belief-centered terms, which are very conducive to a reading of Protestant Christianity, but is quite different from the way that Joyce understood Ashtanga Yoga. So from the judge's perspective, the school district removed the religion from the program by removing religious sounding language. Thus, there was nothing that could be arguably deemed religious. And the key example given by the judge is that the so-called lotus position was renamed crisscross applesauce. Now, one interesting bit about this conclusion is that the curriculum didn't actually remove the term lotus. In fact, it appeared 194 times, and videos submitted into evidence by the school district also used the word lotus. The word crisscross applesauce never appeared. It was produced by witnesses during the court case to try and downplay religious sounding language, and that was convincing to the judge. The judge concluded that a reasonable student would not objectively perceive that EUSD yoga either advances or inhibits religion. So from the perspective of the judge, yoga is religious, but as long as children do not recognize yoga as religious because of changes in language, it's permissible in the public schools. So that's one court case on yoga. I want to make a comparison to another case in which I also had the opportunity to learn and to testify as an expert witness. And this was super brain yoga in a Pennsylvania charter school. And it was a case of Education for New Generations Charter School versus the North Penn School District, which was concluded in 2016. Now, super brain yoga was developed by one Master Choa Kok Sui from the Philippines. It was a modernization of Thapakuranam, which is a ritual of devotion to Ganesh. Basically, it involves moving the vital energy up through the body from the sex chakra up to the crown chakra in order to raise intelligence without study and achieve God realization. You like cross your arms, pinch your earlobes, do some breathing, and some squats. Now, what's interesting in this case is that one of the co-founders of the charter school, Dr. Glenn Mendoza, was a pediatrician who, in a separate legal action in a New York hospital where he worked, was looking for protections of his super brain yoga and other related practices under the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. And so he didn't want to be stopped from doing these practices in the hospital. And his argument was that this was a devoted spiritual practice rooted in religion and ancient spiritual teachings of meditation, no different than being Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, Catholic, or Muslim. So when free exercise was at stake, Mendoza wanted super brain yoga to be counted as religion. But when it was a matter of having a charter school, he wanted it to be removed from religion and placed into the realm of education. This was not persuasive to the school district or ultimately to the Board of Education in Pennsylvania. Now, the school district in Pennsylvania had a very different financial motive than the one in California. They stood to lose $1 million a year because funds follow charter schools away from the regular schools in Pennsylvania. And so they were looking for a reason to oppose the charter school. Initially, this went to the Charter Appeal Board that approved the charter school above the objections of the school district. But then just before the final deadline, evidence of the connections to the super brain yoga and the religious context, for instance, of that New York lawsuit, were brought to the Charter Appeal Board's attention, and the charter rescinded on the grounds that charter schools, like other public schools, must be non-sectarian and not provide any religious instruction. Now, in my evaluation, having looked at both of these cases, I don't actually think that the Pennsylvania yoga program was any more religious than the California case, but there are very different political and financial factors that were involved in these cases. In both instances, there was a tendency of the court to use a fairly Protestant idea that religion is reducible to language, despite how ill-fitting that might be to a concept of religion such as Joyce's, that it's what you do with your body that is devotion. And that can instill devotion, whether one wants it or not, to quote Joyce. Let me turn then to another related often practice, mindfulness, which also has become quite popular in public schools. And then I'll circle back to talk about both practices together. Jon Kabat-Zinn is one of the key popularizers of mindfulness-based stress reduction. And so as Kabat-Zinn tells his origin story when he's in certain contexts, is that he wanted to take the heart of something as meaningful, as sacred, as you will, as Buddha Dharma, or the Buddhist way of life, and bring it into the world in a way that doesn't dilute, profane, or distort it, but at the same time is not locked up into a culturally and tradition-bound framework that would make it absolutely impenetrable to the vast majority of people. In other words, people aren't going to want mindfulness if they see it as Buddhist. And so he presented it as a stress-reducing scientific practice. In Kabat-Zinn's evaluation, the term mindfulness is useful because it does a double duty. It sounds quite neutral. It's just paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. But he also sees it as an umbrella term, which subsumes all of the other elements of the Eightfold Noble Path of Buddhism. It is the heart of Buddhist meditation and the essence of the Buddhist teachings. Stress, likewise, both sounds like a medical diagnosis, and it's a way of translating dukkha, or suffering, the first of the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. According to Kabat-Zinn, mindfulness is a kind of skillful means for bringing the Dharma into mainstream settings, and MBSR and similar programs are secular, Dharma-based portals into deeper teachings of Buddhism. And so from Kabat-Zinn's evaluation, the underpinnings of MBSR make it a full expression of the essence of the Dhamma, all presented in 8 weeks with just secular sounding language. And yet it encompasses the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, right mindfulness being the 7th aspect of that path. It presents to practitioners the 4 foundations leading to an awakening. It instills the 3 marks of existence: suffering, impermanence, and no self. It communicates a kind of worldview. It counteracts the 3 poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion, cultivates the 3 jewels and the 4 virtues, including loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And so it's a way of presenting a certain way of looking at the self and the world and the worldview that's coming from, without setting off alarms that religion is being introduced into public schools. According to some of Kabat-Zinn's followers, it is, in their words, stealth Buddhism. And I take this language from a BuddhistGeek.com interview with Trudy Goodman, in which she talks about wanting to bring mindfulness into public spaces, and notes that the practices are actually very similar. They aren't that different from our Buddhist classes. We just use a different vocabulary. And then afterwards, some practitioners will migrate into Buddhism, and this she defines as stealth Buddhism. Now, there have been some controversies over mindfulness in public schools. None of these have yet made it all the way to litigation, although the closest to this was in Cape Cod, Massachusetts in 2016, a case in which there were legal memoranda which were circulated, and I had an opportunity to consult with both parties in this case, both the mindfulness program and those who were bringing the complaints. And so what I end up kind of concluding after having looked at a lot of yoga and mindfulness programs in public schools is that there is actually a way out of some of these controversies. And my proposal is of an opt-in model of informed consent. And so here I make a distinction between passive opt-out programs where, for instance, there's yoga or mindfulness presented in the classroom and a student can ask to opt out of that, but otherwise the default is you opt in. Whereas in an opt-in or active consent program, you make the decision that you want to be a part of that program. There's no stigma attached if you choose not to. With the opt-out programs, there can still be implicit coercion through, for instance, teacher authority, peer pressure, and just mandatory attendance laws if we're in a K-12 setting. And so there's more of a room for voluntary action in that kind of active program. And the best way in public school settings, and courts have analyzed this with various programs, is with a before or after school or a program during lunch recess. The informed consent part of this is providing full information about both the science and the religion involved in yoga and mindfulness. And there's controversy on both of these aspects. Ultimately, the principles are transparency and voluntarism. And so let me take those in turn. So the science part of this is the first part of the transparency. There's a lot of hype about mindfulness and yoga being cure-alls for problems in public schools. The scientific evidence is actually weaker than this media hype. This is something that I go into a lot more depth in some of my writings. So for instance, there are some challenging and adverse effects which are underreported. Yoga and mindfulness can actually increase anxiety and depression, physical pain. They can cause a reliving of traumatic memories, increase aggression, and even increase risk of suicidality. There are also contraindications such as a history of trauma, PTSD or abuse, depression, suicidality, addiction, and psychological disorders. There are alternatives to yoga and mindfulness, which scientific studies show have comparable benefits. For instance, aerobic exercise, taking a nap, listening to music, doing a mentally challenging activity such as math, even eating a healthy lunch. More to the point, though, in terms of the religious material that I've been discussing, practices can be both scientifically supported and religious. For instance, there's scientific evidence that going to church can be good for your health. It's still a religious practice and not something permissible by courts for public schools. So the first principle here then is transparency about both the scientific and the religious factors, which leads to voluntarism. There are certain Christians, Jews, Muslims, atheists, Hindus, and Buddhists who object to mandatory yoga and mindfulness programs as being religiously coercive. Now, some members of all of these groups are enthusiastic about these programs, but that's not true for everyone. There also is empirical evidence which supports the conclusion that length and frequency of even secularly packaged yoga and mindfulness practice correlates with a drop in levels of monotheism and a rise in spiritual but not religious identities and Buddhist identities, as well as identities with all religions. And so the practice of engaging in yoga or mindfulness can cause shifts in spirituality. And so that would also be part of an informed consent process, part of the transparency, and also why voluntarism is important with these programs. Many programs do actually have a goal of mandatory participation. They want yoga and meditation competency to be required for teacher credentialing and to be considered an essential component of the education system. Mind Up, the program of Goldie Hawn, the mission is to be absolutely mandated in schools across the country and beyond. There are teachers in British Columbia and California, for instance, who have lost their jobs because they refuse to teach mindfulness in their classrooms. Opting out, I've suggested, is not as suitable as opting in terms of addressing some of the issues of subtle and indirect coercion. And thus, where I finally land after analyzing a lot of programs is that an opt-in model of informed consent allows programs to be offered on school grounds. And so those who are convinced that yoga is beneficial, it's helpful for them, they want it to be available for students, they can do that, but they can do it through this opt-in model of informed consent while also upholding principles of transparency and voluntarism. So that's where I land in a lot of my research, and that's where we'll end for today. So thank you so much for giving me a chance to share with you all today.
Yes, thanks for sharing your knowledge and fascinating research with us, Candy, and it's good to see you again.
Nice to see you as well.
All right, if you're just tuning in, this is Thursdays at Home. Every other Thursday from May 28th through August 6th, please join IU Theater and Dance for IU Theater Thursdays, a live stream broadcast event featuring students performing songs, monologues, dance and poetry, interviews with faculty, staff, and alumni, and segments that highlight the design and tech elements of theater. They will also be introducing their newest faculty members and reminiscing with retiring faculty. Check out their website or social media for more details. Our final guest of the evening is Jeff Nelson. Jeff is a professor of horn at the IU Jacobs School of Music and founder of Fearless Performance LLC, a company that focuses on training musicians and others to consistently perform their best. His experience as a performer includes touring with Barry Manilow and Michael Bolton, recording with Michael Bublé and pop band Bare Naked Ladies, touring and recording with Canadian Brass, and performing for the premiere runs of award-winning Broadway musicals and on dozens of movie and video game soundtracks. He has also been in the horn section for dozens of major US city orchestras and has performed concerti and chamber music on 6 continents. Tonight, he'll be presenting on Fearless Performance, his method for mastering the mental process of performance. But before we welcome Jeff, here is a brief clip of him performing with Canadian Brass.
Wow, what amazing lectures. Hi, everybody. My brain is full of listening to all this information. And then, yeah, that video was Canadian Brass in, I think, 2004, just north of where I am now here in Toronto. And it's called just simply Quintet, written by Michael Kamen, who wrote about 70 different movie soundtracks, all the Die Hards and Lethal Weapons and Mr. Holland's Opus. And he wrote that for us. It's, in the spirit of fearless performance and talking about that, the end of that video was the last shot of the day in mid-November. So we're also freezing, which you can't tell on the video. And I'm standing, it was my idea, to stand at the top of this cliff for that last dramatic shot. And it took some real mental gymnastics to stand there. However, I may have built communication towers for 2 summers for a summer job that I might bring up later. So I saw an interesting slide in Candy's lecture, I think it was Candy, I'm sorry, about where it says teaching math and science isn't the only ways to grow a great human being. And I passionately agree with that, because all of the knowledge in the world, and I mainly work with musicians, but I work with athletes and business entrepreneurs and teachers and all the different ways that we perform. And you can have all the skills and studies and information and knowledge that you want, but if you walk out in front of someone else and start using some of your brain to worry about what people think and who's there and what you could get if you do well, the next thought is, uh-oh, what's going to happen if I don't do well? Through my experience, then there's this other area of training. And for me, it's the performer aspect. So I've been working on that for a long time. And it's amazing to be able to teach. This is my 14th year now teaching at the Jacob School, which is full of performers trying to figure out their technician, but then it's not just about what you can do, but it's walking on stage and doing it on your first version and musically, not just accurately. So there's a lot to this. So let's get started. How I define performance is you are engaged in performance when what you are doing matters. I collected how many performances I did one morning, and I got up to 200 before lunch because I was getting out of a chair and I slipped. Okay, that performance could have been better. All these different performing of things. So to make a performance, a fearless performance, make what you are doing the only thing that matters. So you're not worried about what people think about what you're doing or what you could get when you're engaged in the act of performance. So this is the big line that I draw between practice or preparation and performance, is once you cross that line into performance, there's a few rules that serve you better, following in specific ways, like there's no past, and to turn the critic off and live in that performance area so that you have all your mind free to be used for execution, and then learn later after you do the performance and make it better for next time, all that focus. The fearless part, fearless performance, comes from a lot of, I'm very fearful. It comes from a real place of a lot of fear. And I got pretty tired of walking on stage optimistic and walking off stage disappointed. So I also picked Fearless as the name, even though it has fear in the title. It's too late now for me to change that. But I don't think we'd have as many people listening to a loveful performance lecture. But also Fearless, I think, is better than confident performance. I think if once we decide we need confidence, we've decided something about that performance arena that I need my confidence for. Whereas children, I think, are just beautifully fearless, and they come into the arena and, okay, I want the cookie. What's in front of me? I don't care. I get the cookie. All that clearer focus that we see in children and inspired by that. So that's where fearless performance, and a lot of time for me, the fearless part is a result after the fact. I want to give a fearless performance that I'm focused on things that'll serve my audience, serve my music and everything. And I know afterwards if it was. I'm too busy during focusing on what's going on stage. It's the same as when you're present, right? As soon as you think you're present, you're not. So I think it's the same with fearless along the way. So basically, the idea is if you've ever experienced this before, then fearless performance is for you, or some sort of study in the performing, and it's preparing something to a certain level and then walk out to perform it for one person or 1,000 people and have it go not quite as well. I ask people around the world if they've ever experienced that, and everyone's hand goes up, mine as well. And you've experienced basically what I call the quality gap. It's the difference between what we can do or think we can do, or that's all. This already gets more complicated in a different lecture. What we can do and what we actually do live and in person on our first and only shot, or whatever that is. That's the quality gap, difference between those two. And the goal for this study of fearless performance is to shrink that quality gap and be able to consistently perform your best on your first version. One of the ideas in music performance that inspires me, gives me good fear too, to get me off the couch and prepare well, is that they will never hear your second version of anything. So again, that kind nudge and healthy fear and a reminder that it doesn't matter that I can do it. I need to do it on my first version. And I also come from a place of very real fear, big results of ways that I can easily go to the imposter syndrome. I never finished my bachelor degree and full professor at IU. Shh, please don't tell anybody. And so I can think of myself as a fraud very easily. But when I auditioned for the teaching position at IU, I would just go to my strengths, go to your strengths, Jeff. I prepared a lot. And when I called my wife, it wasn't, I'm extra scared today. It's, I would always say instead, just to have solution-based language, I'd say, I'm replacing more fearful thoughts than usual today. Keep telling myself I was replacing them. And I'd catch the fear as early as I could and then replace it as quickly as I could, over and over and over again. So that's what I'm sharing with my students and people that I talk to about fearless performance in my TED Talk in Bloomington. I hosted the TED Talk at the IU Auditorium a couple years later, terrified out of my mind, full IU Auditorium. But I also ended up coaching people on their TED Talks. While I was preparing for mine, we'd have parties and get together to practice performing. And that's the place where we can learn the most about it, is the experience of performing. One of the first times I experienced the biggest quality gap, and why I tell these stories is I heard from one of the productivity people I follow named Brendan Burchard. Highly recommend him. He says, most people connect more to your story of struggle than your story of success. So that shifted my teaching quite a bit when I heard that. So here's a few of my stories of struggle. One of the first ones was basketball. I had quit horn in high school to try and play basketball. And I grew up on a pig farm as well, another fraud for a potential thinking less of myself as a classical French horn player, that I grew up on a pig farm. 8 people in my town. So that helps me say, if I can do it, you can do it. You know, there's no rules here. So I could shoot free throws really well on the farm. And then my first public game, I was on the court and I drew the foul. And I went to the free throw line, but I remembered Laura Kalinowski was watching. She was sitting in the stands. So I did my cool 3 dribble bounce thing and then did my cool shot, and the ball barely made it halfway to the hoop. So somehow all that concern outside of what I was doing made my arm turn into jello, you know, it's just wild. So, and then with horn, the same thing, that I'd be very prepared to play well, and I'd walk out and get much more concerned about other things along the way. And then I built towers for 2 summers, 300-foot high communication towers. And the biggest thing I learned from that was and we had no safety lines. So when I was up 300 feet, climb to where you were going, and then you'd belt in through the tower, and then you have to lean away from the tower. Lots of mental gymnastics to focus on what I was doing right there. First time up the tower, I went up about 20 feet, 30 feet. The foreman had given me a hard hat. And I was like, thanks. How's this gonna help? I put it on, started climbing. I've climbed things on the farm, so I was okay. And then about 30 feet up, I got above the trees and I looked and I was like, oh, okay, wow. And then I looked down, which was fine. And then I looked up and my hard hat came off and it spun and flew and hit the tower and landed where my body would land if it fell. And I was like, okay. And then the next time I realized, okay, now when I'm climbing, I'm only holding on with one hand for a second. So I checked it and then I would go like that and do all this weird stuff that I wasn't doing down on the first 10 feet. So I realized there it was 100% mental as well. And then if I missed a step on a tower, there was a lot worse results than if I missed a note playing horn. Yeah, so that was a lot of learning. Also, my foreman told me once you go higher than 40 feet, it doesn't matter how much higher you go if you fall. Anyway, so that was inspiring to be very detailed with what I was doing along the way. So I then started looking at how I felt in the practice room and how much of it was mental. If I'm sitting in the room and I'm fine, or wherever you're doing your preparation for the upcoming performance, that's what I call the build phase. So I separated and labeled into build, be, share, build, be, share, over and over and over again. Build phase, I'm practicing, I feel safe, I decide I feel safe. But then what became really interesting is when I hear someone at the door, I choose to freak out. Oh no, someone's at the door. And then I look and it's a 5-year-old kid. I choose to calm down. And then I go, oh wait, that's my teacher's kid. I choose to freak out. And then I look, there's my teacher. Oh no, I freak out more. All of these movable standards drove me crazy. And it was fine if it inspired me to practice more in the build phase. And the B phase is backstage. I could freak out about who's out there or not. And I've trained a lot to figure out how to stand backstage and be present, let go of what I coulda, shoulda, woulda, and walk out and perform. But then once I'm out there, it's about execution at that point, serving things better than my fears and doing the best with what I got. And that was the big study for me, and figuring out how to do it enough to be good enough, above the enough, not enough line, whether the line of success is higher ability or just making this one phrase sound simple and beautiful. So that, you know, to simply make your performance a fearless performance, make what you are doing the only thing that matters, that's super simple. It's not very easy. But if we make it simpler, it can get easier. So it's that real focus on the things to revere, the differences between performance and practice along the way. So I looked into that, studied it, and did thousands and thousands of what I call magic line performances. It's practicing walking in. I realized that's where the big difference was when I walked. Then I made the mistake of deciding this time matters more. Whereas I think if we leave room for anything to matter more, we just haven't made all the other times matter enough. So that simplicity of just make every note matter and be covered in musical intent, make every shot matter, and all these different ways of building habits when we prepare that serve us well in performance when we can't go back and redo it. And we're building habits in the preparation stage, regardless of how well we're playing or how well we're studying it. It's just, habits that will serve our performance or not. That's what we get to decide during our preparation. I'm in a great place because I get to do that with both Canadian Brass and through my teaching. And being able to, Canadian Brass is known throughout the world. We're just in our 50th year of performing, and the group got known really well on the Tonight Show early on in the 70s. Brass Quintet, well, you saw it on the screen if you haven't seen us before. And excuse me, when they started in the 70s, they spoke to the audience and shared who they were, and done in an authentic manner. Never made the music the joke, but still had some humor mixed with virtuosity and all these things along the way. Same with teaching, that we get to perform and connect and show our struggles. And when I had that problem, this is how I work on it, that kind of approach to performance. So I recall one thing with the mental game and focusing on how to connect your practice to your performance and your execution. Tell a quick story. Grew up on a pig farm, 1,000 pigs, and it was getting near lunchtime, and the watering system that took water to the 1,000 pigs had broken, and I had a pipe wrench, and I was trying to loosen the pipe and was working on it and couldn't get it. My dad walked up, and he's 6'6", and he's like, "How's it going?" And I said, "I'm sorry, I messed up this story. Sorry, my brain is so full." That before I told this story, I had a student in my studio who came in for a couple of years and played the horn really well, but didn't really inspire us as much as he could musically. So he wasn't going for the phrase for a musical intention. It was more for accuracy and to avoid mistakes. And I said, "Mike, how are we going to get you to tell more of a story, take more risks, make the greater phrase, and then clean that up and get it accurate, but to tell more stories with colors and emotion?" And he's like, "I don't know, I'm trying this and this." I said, "Okay, let me tell you a story." That's when I told him the story. Sorry about that. So I told him the story about the pig farm. Watering system break. I'm trying to get it. I look up at my dad. I say, I can't get it. And he said, "Okay, let's go." And I said, "Well, what about the pigs?" And he said, "They'll die. Come on, I'm hungry. Let's go for lunch." And we went to walk away, and I was like, I grabbed the pipe wrench and got it loose. I looked up all proud, and he had already walked away. I was like, "What do you want?" "Well, good, you did it." And so I told this story to my student. He said, "Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. See you next week." "Yep, see you next week. Go, do it." And he went away, came back the next week, played glorious, amazing, rich phrases and colors, and it was amazing. And I was like, "Okay, first, that was incredible. And what'd you do? What happened?" And he said, "Come here." And I went around and looked on his music stand, and on his music, he had written in huge letters, "Save the pigs." So he had this initiative in him to get it done, just get it there, regardless of putting in 2 hours of practice or whatever we learn that we should do, or to get it right. And he moved way beyond that. And one of the big things is practicing walking into the room. I do magic as a hobby, so I call it the magic line performance, putting the magic line between backstage and on stage, and walk into that. And so that training is what I put my students through. And there's ways of standing there with what I have an inspirational sheet. It says things on it like, they want you to play well. Don't ask, tell. Don't be too Canadian. Sorry about that. Let me get out of your way, but share a few noises first, eh? It's been my learning. And it's really, just to sum it up, people come to Fearless Camp, and when they work with me, they come to, I think for the most part as musicians, we want to get our technician better. I'm watching The Last Dance right now. That's where the TV is. That's why I pointed over there, with Michael Jordan on Netflix, and it's identical to athletic training, of course. And but he does the work. He's bored with how much work he does, but it's the transcending technique to be able to tell the story and make those successes happen. So musicians were trained to be an amazing technician. And a lot of us, the way we listen to music, it's like, what an amazing technician, right? So that's where we put our success definition, is in the technician. And if we make mistakes on stage, we blame our technician, go practice more technique. But there's more to it than that. There is that learning to walk out there and stay in the same state that you are when you feel safe in your practice room and when you're alone. Stay that idiot. Phil Meyer is the former principal horn in the New York Philharmonic, and I played with him quite a bit. And he just casually said at lunch one day, he said, you know, I don't go out there to play my best anymore. I just go out there to play like me. It's genius. Doesn't matter who's out there or what. So they come to get their technician better. Then we put stories to their music and get them to be doing more to their music. Their technician gets better just by setting better goals. I love the saying, there comes a time when what pushes you begins to pull you. Musical stuff starts pulling them. And then the final big reveal and big realization is that it's about sharing of themselves, sharing those stories and a piece of who they are, and that's okay. Brené Brown's TED Talk about power of vulnerability, that last slide, it just says, I am enough, written across someone's chest. And that's what we're after. And in society, with what we're doing right now, what we're discussing right now, we're trying to teach or trying to mentor and show, that authenticity comes through abilities in performance and trusting who we are, loving that, and sharing it. To close, I want to tell you two quick things. I saw a commercial last night, and I quickly wrote it down, and it was pretty amazing. I can't remember what the commercial was about. I think health insurance or something, but it said, so with this new thing, it's not about anymore whether we can do it or can't, but it's whether we will do it or we won't. And I think this session about performance training and learning about who we are, and mindfulness, and all these things helps us learn that it's a will or won't. We can learn more and go deeper about it. And then I'd like to close with one of these pieces of art done by a man named Brian Andreas. And I had one of my former students who now writes in Hollywood for How to Train Your Dragon and Disney. He wrote a piece for my wife and I. She's an opera singer. And the last piece of art, and in this piece, just says this. It's a beautiful idea. It's got childish writing and a childish piece of art. And it says, in my dream, the angel shrugged and said, if we fail this time, it will be a failure of imagination. And then she placed the whole world gently in the palm of my hand. That's it. That's all I got. Go be fearless.
Thanks for sharing your philosophy and process with us, Jeff. I loved your definition of performance. That just really resonated with me.
Nice. Yay.
Yeah. And thank you to all of our guests who joined us this week for Thursdays at Home. We're grateful for your time and your devotion to your craft and your generosity in sharing it with our community. If you've missed any of our previous Thursdays at Home or Confronting Racism episodes, you can find those videos on our website or on the IU Bloomington YouTube channel. We'll be back on July 30th with another episode. Keep an eye on our social media channels, where we'll be announcing upcoming performers soon. Thanks for joining us and have a great evening.